Have you ever wondered, can a family truly become more powerful than states? While a king sits on the throne, could the real decision be made by someone invisible? While an emperor trusts his army, could he actually be dependent on a banker's approval? And more importantly, are the rules of a monetary order that no one elected but everyone still lives inside today, written centuries ago by a single family? If so, then this is not just the story of the Rothschild family. It is about understanding how money turns into power, and why power so often remains invisible. Imagine a single family so powerful that even emperors bowed to their credit. Kings shaped their war plans according to that family's financial strength, and governments either stood or collapsed depending on the loans they received from them. For more than a century, the Rothschilds were not merely bankers. They were an invisible system standing at the center of Europe's flow of money and political influence. Their story unfolds almost like a political thriller. In an age when states struggled to move soldiers, they moved money across borders at great speed. And they did it with remarkable ease. Their influence was felt inside palaces, yet their faces were often unseen. And the most striking part was this: they did not need to wear crowns or build armies to possess power. They laid the foundations of modern finance, and we are still living inside that structure today. So how exactly did one family do what states could not? To understand that, we need to return to Europe in the late 18th century. At the time, the continent was filled with competing kingdoms and empires. Austria, Prussia, France, Britain, and the decaying Holy Roman Empire among them. War was almost a permanent condition. Monarchies were fragile, and state treasuries frequently fell into difficulty. Gold and silver were still the basis of money, but the cost of war had grown so large that kings were consuming resources faster than they could mint money. In precisely such an environment, credit ceased to be a tool of comfort and became a condition of political survival. And at this point, Mayer Amschel Rothschild entered the stage. Born in Frankfurt in 1744, Mayer was not someone born into power. He began by trading coins in a small shop in the city's Jewish ghetto. But he soon realized that merely buying and selling money was not enough. The real profit was in managing wealth for the rich and producing financial solutions for aristocrats. So how could someone who came out of a small shop influence Europe? Mayer's real rise began when he became the financial representative of the Prince of Hesse. At that time, this prince was one of the wealthiest men in Europe, and for Mayer, this connection was not merely a new client but a gateway into the system itself. The relationship gave him prestige and also the chance to see how large-scale finance worked. By the time the Napoleonic Wars began, Mayer was no longer an ordinary banker. He had laid the foundation of a dynasty. But what truly set him apart from others was the scale at which he thought. He sent his 5 sons to 5 different centers of Europe: London, Paris, Vienna, Naples, and Frankfurt. In this way, a family network emerged that was more flexible and faster than anything most states could easily build. The real revolution was beginning here. In an age when news was carried on horseback and countries could collapse within months because of war, the system Mayer built functioned almost like a private intelligence and financial network. His sons could open credit in one city while collecting debts in another, move money across borders, and most importantly, distribute risk. If Paris suffered losses, London could remain standing. If Vienna fell into trouble, Frankfurt could provide support. This structure was not merely a family business, it was a diversification model built on a geopolitical scale. The Rothschilds succeeded not only in growing money, but also in keeping it alive amid political uncertainty. The secret of their power was not merely wealth, but their ability to build networks. And in wartime, such a network was more valuable than gold itself. The Napoleonic Wars transformed the Rothschilds from clever bankers into Europe's great financiers. Governments needed money constantly. Britain in particular had fallen into enormous debt in its war against Napoleon. Armies had to be paid, fed, equipped, and supplied logistically. But traditional state treasuries were too slow, too fragile, and often too ineffective to bear that burden. The Rothschilds filled precisely this gap. Thanks to the courier network they had built, they were able to move both information and gold faster than official state channels. In those days, sometimes even a single day's delay could lead an army to retreat or collapse. Speed was not merely an advantage, it was an element that determined the outcome of war. Could a piece of information change the fate of a country? The most famous story told about Nathan Rothschild was born here. According to the rumor, Nathan learned of Napoleon's defeat before anyone else, sold British bonds to trigger panic, and then secretly bought them back once prices collapsed, making a vast fortune. Over the years, this story was exaggerated so much that it almost turned into legend. The full story was probably not as dramatic as the legend suggests. But there was a real element at its core. Rothschild couriers really were extremely fast. Nathan truly could use his informational advantage in the markets. And after Waterloo, the British government's dependence on Rothschild credit increased even further. So whether events happened exactly as the story tells them or not, the essential truth does not change. In the new age, information and credit had become the most powerful weapons of empires. And the Rothschilds held both of those weapons in their hands. By the 1820s, they were no longer financing only wars. They were financing peace as well. They lent money to governments across Europe, organized the sale of major state bonds, and played a role in establishing financial stability. They were influential across a broad economic field stretching from railways in France and Austria, to canals in Britain, to mining investments in Spain. When countries wanted to recover or restructure their economies, they issued bonds, and the Rothschilds were often at the center of that process. By bringing sovereign debt into a system of order and standardization, they created the precursor model of today's global bond markets. If state borrowing now seems ordinary to us, it is because that system has become a natural part of life. But the real question is this: where exactly did the power of money begin? The Rothschilds saw something very early on. Real power is not in accumulating gold in a vault, but in controlling access to capital. Deciding who can find credit, under what conditions they can borrow, and what the cost of that borrowing will be, that was real power. That is why they were not merely earning interest income. They were also indirectly determining which states could breathe, which could carry out reforms, and which would drown under the burden of debt. They did not need to seize the throne. They were making those who sat on the throne dependent on them. And this is exactly where invisible power creates the most fear. By the middle of the 19th century, whispers about the Rothschilds began to spread across Europe. People debated whether they stood behind the British Empire, whether they influenced revolutions, whether they had established an invisible power. Conspiracy theories did not appear out of nowhere. People intuitively sensed that something had changed. Power was shifting from the throne to the market. The strongest seat in the room was no longer only the king's throne. The bond market had also become a center of power. And at the very center of that market stood the Rothschilds. For this reason, their story is not merely the legend of a family. It is a turning point at which the relationship between money and power was rewritten. So what was the real thing everyone overlooked? Most people read the Rothschild story merely as the wealth of a dynasty. But the matter was much bigger than that. Their real importance was not that they became rich on their own, but that they built the skeleton of modern finance. International networks, state bond markets, the geographic distribution of risk, rapid information flow, and government's dependence on private credit. All of these are still parts of the system we live in today. So the issue is not simply that the Rothschilds became very powerful. The real issue is that the model they built outgrew the family's direct influence and turned into a permanent system. Even as the family's individual influence declined over time, the structure they created continued to live on. The real inheritance was not wealth, but the system. By the middle of the 19th century, the Rothschilds had reached their peak. Their branches stretching across Europe functioned almost like a nervous system. After Waterloo, They financed Britain, Austria during its reform era, France under the July monarchy, and even the papacy. When economies shook and governments entered crisis, people turned to them for stability. At a time when central banks in the modern sense had not yet fully formed, the Rothschilds effectively acted like a central financial authority. Their support could make a state bond succeed, and their absence could lead it to fail. They influenced not only governments, but also market confidence. Was their power limited only to state debt? No. The Rothschilds also invested in the sectors that formed the lifeblood of the Industrial Revolution. Railways, mines, infrastructure projects. Their capital frequently appeared in these areas that enabled Europe's physical transformation. Their investments stretched from copper mines in Spain to oil in the Caucasus, even to the Suez Canal. If capital was oxygen for industrial growth, then the Rothschilds were one of the few great powers controlling the flow of that oxygen. They were financiers not only of wartime economies, but also of peacetime development. But no power is eternal. Even at the height of their strength, they were not without rivals. Other great banking families such as the Barings, the Hottingers, and the Warburgs were also struggling for influence. Moreover, the model the Rothschilds had built so successfully was too effective to remain in private hands forever. Toward the end of the 19th century, states began to develop their own institutional financial structures. Central banks grew stronger, markets became more regulated, and dependence on a single family declined. The Bank of England and the Bank of France gained strength. Later, the United States established the Federal Reserve System. Thus, the era in which private dynasties dominated state credit gradually gave way to the age of institutional banking. And then history entered the stage in a harsher form. The 20th century arrived with great disasters that shattered the old European order. 2 world wars, revolutions, the Great Depression, and the Holocaust changed not only politics, but also the fate of families. Like other Jewish families, the Rothschilds too suffered severe persecution. Their properties in Austria, Germany, and France were seized by the Nazis. The family lost their palaces, businesses, art collections, and a significant part of their economic influence. After the war, their power never fully returned to its former level. The world was now moving in another direction. So, as they declined, did the system decline as well? Quite the opposite. The rise of America after 1945, the dollar becoming the global center, and the enormous expansion of modern finance closed the era in which any single private family could control the whole system. From then on, Wall Street, major banks, and central banks were setting the rules of the game. But here the real paradox emerged. While the Rothschilds' personal dominance weakened, the system they had helped develop grew even larger. State bonds became the cornerstone of modern economies. International debt markets expanded. The rapid movement of information, the control of credit flows, and the ability of market confidence to determine political fate all became normal features of the global system. So the family shrank, but the world they built grew. This is exactly the point at which conspiracy theories gained strength. As the Rothschilds' real influence became more limited over time, their transformation into a symbol of invisible control accelerated even more. People began to describe them as a faceless power secretly directing wars, revolutions, and economies from behind the curtain. But the deeper and more disturbing truth was this: they no longer needed to secretly control the system, because the system itself already carried their legacy. The influence was no longer in the family name so much as embedded in the financial structure itself. Are we still living inside that same shadow today? Yes, descendants of the Rothschild line still exist today. The family continues to operate in the financial world through Rothschild and Company, headquartered in Paris. They manage wealth, provide corporate advisory services, and deal with billions of dollars in assets. They are still a wealthy and influential family. However, they are no longer the emperors of finance. Compared to modern giants such as BlackRock, J.P. Morgan, and Goldman Sachs, today's Rothschilds carry much more limited weight. Jacob Rothschild, who died in 2024, was remembered more for philanthropy, prestige, and cultural influence. Figures such as David René de Rothschild and Nat Rothschild are still powerful names in finance and business, but they are not in a position to govern governments. But their traces are still everywhere in the system. Whenever we speak of a debt crisis, whether it is the 1982 Mexican crisis, the 2010 Greek crisis, or the repeatedly resurfacing debt problems of Argentina, we hear the echo of the world order the Rothschilds helped shape. When central banks set interest rates, when governments issue bonds, when markets punish countries because of budget deficits, the logic of a system built 2 centuries ago is still operating. The pattern they left behind was very clear. Finance is an invisible yet extremely effective weapon of power. It can rule without showing a sword, and direct events without raising an army. And perhaps this is the most disturbing part of the whole story. Because most people live as if the monetary system were a neutral tool. But history shows that this is not true. The story of the Rothschilds tells us that money is not merely an object used for exchange. It is also a mechanism that produces power, control, and dependency. Money can build railways, and it can finance wars. It can save governments, and it can trap societies in long-term cycles of debt. The family may no longer stand at the center of power, but the machine they perfected still does. And without understanding that machine, it is impossible to escape its rules. So perhaps the real lesson is this. It is easy to become fixated on the idea that one family is still secretly ruling the world today. But the real danger is not there. The real danger is that a financial architecture once built has now outgrown individuals and turned into the system itself. The Rothschilds' lasting influence is not that they ruled forever. It is that they designed a credit and debt order that outlived them. If you want financial freedom, you must first understand that order. Because whether it is the kings of the 19th century or the people of the 21st century living under credit card debt, the trap is the same. At the center of the system stands the lender, not the borrower. And history is still speaking to us here. History does not repeat itself exactly, but it moves in rhyme. And the story of the Rothschilds is one such rhyme that still echoes today. It reminds us of this. Real wealth is not simply having money. Real power is being able to write the rules of money. If you do not learn this lesson, history will crush you under its own order. But if you do learn it, you will at least begin to see how the game is set up. If this gave you a new perspective, don't forget to like the video and subscribe. History speaks. Those who listen win. Stay well.